Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Egan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlawn Next and based in Egan. Through Westlawn Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
Welcome. Access to Democracy returns. Not yet. Welcome. Access to Democracy returns for the second time. We missed a cue there. And I'm your usual host, Alan Miller. We've been talking whether this is the 15th or the 16th year. We're not quite sure. We know we've done about 1,600 interviews, and we're lucky to have a interview client or interviewee with us today, Steve Hunegs of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, which we didn't say in the credits, who was good enough to return. And he's been here quite a few times, and welcome back.
Alan, it's a pleasure to be here, always with you and Sharon and the entire crew. Great professionalism, great interviews, a lot of fun too.
Good. Well, keep coming back.
If you invite me, I'll keep coming back, but I'm going to turn the tables for 1 second, and I'm going to not ask the first question, but make the opening statement if I can, because I have a birthday present for you and many happy returns.
This is the birthday that's never ending.
It shouldn't ever end. Why not? We should always be together for joyful occasions. And I'm sorry I missed the birthday party. But I have something here that's a gift for you, and it bears a little explanation. It is the movie poster for a documentary called Above and Beyond, which is going to make its Twin Cities debut on October 26th, Sunday, October 26th at the Riverview Theater. And it's autographed to you, as you can see, to Alan Miller, to a great journalist, thanking you for your interest in Israel. Signed from Leon Frankel. Now, Leon Frankel was a World War II hero.
The late Leon Frankel.
No, Leon's with us.
Is he still
Thankfully
with us?
with us.
Oh.
Leon, a World War II hero, won a Distinguished Flying Cross and a Navy Cross as a naval pilot in the Second World War in the Pacific, 67 carrier
Thank you.
landings.
Thank you.
Then, in 1948, flew as a foreign volunteer in Israel's War of Independence.
That's
flew
what it was,
25
yeah.
missions and was literally present at the creation of the Israel Air Force and became a great friend of people like Ezer Weitzman, who later became defense minister in Israel. He calls many of Israel's founding family, the Pioneer family, his friends because of his willingness to volunteer in the 48 war. If that weren't enough, this documentary is about Squadron 101, and Leon, because he is one of those, thankfully still with us, is interviewed at length. And I think you're going to ask me a little bit about it later.
Why don't we have Leon on Access to Democracy?
I think he'd love to be on the show.
That would be great. Now, we have a surprise for you. And it's speaking of the 26th of October and this documentary, which was done by the sister of Steven Spielberg, a well-known documentarian. And
There it is.
there is your advertising right there. Above and Beyond, with special guest Nancy Spielberg, who will be there.
She is coming.
And it's at the Riverview, 7:30 on the 26th.
Exactly. It's going to be a wonderful evening. I'll do a little bit of Q&A afterwards with Nancy as well as with Leon. And Nancy interviewed a number of the surviving 101 pilots, but she said to me, Leon was her favorite. So come, meet Leon, see the movie. It's wonderful. Have a great evening.
Local boy makes good in 2 wars.
And because we always want to be St. Paul and Minneapolis in my work, Leon, born in St. Paul, now lives in Minneapolis, and as you say, local hero for 2 wars. So thank you.
He's got a fascinating story. I've read some about him, and when I saw that, made it a point to see that Sharon and I are going to attend.
Thank you, and
So
thanks for the support.
That's sponsored by.
Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and very importantly, because we're very proud of the partnership with the Twin Cities Jewish Film Festival. And Nancy Spielberg has graciously agreed to come, and when you meet her, you'll see that she's a very sweet person.
Which is not always said about her brother.
That I don't know. It's really interesting that she says about the documentary, she says the brother is thinking about perhaps making a movie based upon not based on the underlying theme of the activities of the.
You know, if Steven Spielberg gets involved, it then becomes a mega movie.
But just so, I think to be fair to Nancy, she did this on her own. This is her work. She raised the funds and resources necessary to bring this to life. So all credit to Nancy and her entire production team.
Wonderful.
So thank you.
So,
And happy birthday.
hey, thank you again, and thank you for a treasured gift.
You're welcome.
Now, here we are in 5775.
A numerical palindrome.
Who would have thunk it? And things around the world in terms of anti-Semitism, which seems to peak and then slow down and then peak and slow down, in Europe seem to have really risen in the last few months, the last 6 months. Is it because of the Gaza war?
And my theory in life is whenever we talk about a difficult subject, I'm always going to say something positive at the end too. So in answer to the question, likely, yes. It's a recognized phenomena that when there is warfare or struggles between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Arabs, the reverberation, particularly in Europe, is often increased anti-Semitism. That's always concerning.
My feeling is that anti-Semitism is something that's always present. It's quiescent for a period, but it doesn't take much to then flare up and bring it present.
That's accurate. I think there are a couple factors that have concerned people about this recent escalation, if you can put it that way. One is the level of the vitriol and the substance of the vitriol. Much of it well beyond the Israeli-Arab conflict, calling for the death of Jews, that sort of thing. Two, the violence that accompanied it. You had, perhaps unrelated but certainly temporarily connected, the attack in the at the museum, Jewish museum in Brussels. The demonstration in Paris that ended up with literally a siege of Parisians, Jewish Parisians in a synagogue. Any number of rallies in which the most incendiary rhetoric was heard. Some commentators saying such things haven't been expressed publicly since the end of the Second World War.
A rabbi was attacked someplace.
In France, a rabbi was attacked. Certainly a serious spiking of anti-Semitic incidents throughout Europe related to the Gaza conflict.
Well, it's really incredible to me that, you know, you can just flip a switch and all of a sudden it's there again.
A combination of left and right in the sense of the nativist, nationalist, anti-Semitism. You see it in Greece, you see it to some extent in France, but also the anti-Semitism of the left, those who support the Palestinians but have unleashed some of the most awful commentary and, again, vitriol related to Israel. So it's left and right combining to attack Israel and foment anti-Semitism.
Well, it's no secret that in 1991, I spent 17 days in Israel at the start of Operation Desert Storm. I was there within 48 hours after it started by the late Saddam Hussein, and involved Israel, which Israel was not at all involved in his fight with Kuwait, but or his ambitions for Kuwait. And it was one of the great experiences of my life. Also, the closest I have come to warfare, really.
Sure. Well, having shown me your clippings from that time was very impressive reporting. That you were there on the ground.
I was very fortunate to be able to report, to get a good rapport with the censors, both with photographs I was taking and with what I was writing, so that they gave me a little bit of latitude. There were a couple of well-known journalists who were thrown out of the country because they violated the censorship rules. Like they went to a Patriot missile base and they said where it was located. Now at the time, we didn't have American Patriot missiles there, allegedly. On the plane that I flew over on, there were a bunch of young men that said Israel IFD on their t-shirts and had really remarkable Southern accents. And I asked some of them about that. And one of them said, I'm with IFD and I'm from Southern Kentucky, Israel. And it was really interesting that, but those bases were supposed to be kept secret because there weren't that many of them.
Sure.
And they were effective.
Well, being the intrepid reporter that you were, asking all the right questions, but you mentioned Kuwait and all the difficulties of Operation Protective Edge, or the difficulties arising from them. You know, sometimes you hope that out of a difficult situation, perhaps there's an opportunity for a diplomatic breakthrough. If you look at the alignment of forces currently in the Middle East, I mean, you do have Israel and the Palestinian Authority, Egypt, Kuwait, the Saudis, all sort of standing together in a sense against some of the most awful developments that we're seeing now. So the question becomes, can somebody take at least this temporary community of interest and turn it into something where they can have a diplomatic breakthrough? I have no answer to the question. It's just a question that I raise and others have raised.
I had the same question for you. Do you think there can ever be peace in the Middle East, particularly between Israel and the Palestinians?
Well, let's take a step back. There is peace between Israel and the Egyptians. There is peace between
Has
Israel
been for quite a few years.
1979.
And the Jordanians.
And the Jordanians. It's interesting, I have a dear friend, Walid Issa, who's a Palestinian, who's received his graduate degree in economics from St. Cloud State. This is why I say I always hold out hope, because Walid believes that the key to a better future between Israelis and Palestinians is economic development between Israelis and Palestinians. And he and an Israeli friend of his are part of a negotiation process seminar in which they both participated in Harvard, but they're also looking towards economic opportunities between Israelis and Palestinians. And yes, while there are struggles between Israelis and Palestinians, and Chairman Abbas going to the United Nations and accusing Israel of genocide is not helpful, by the way, there are also people of goodwill, Israelis and Palestinians, who want to see that two-state solution of the future arise. And if you take Walid and understand that his motivation is to develop economic relationships between Israelis and Palestinians, it gives you hope.
Well, when I was there, and I had a chance to speak to a lot of Israelis, they want peace. And one evening, I was taken to an undisclosed location where I had a chance to speak with one of the Palestinian leaders in Jerusalem, who happened to have been a pharmacist, and they want peace. But I have the feeling that, and I've had that feeling for years, that some of the people who are in charge of these countries, and Netanyahu certainly is one of them, really don't want peace. I don't think Hamas wants peace, because when they have turmoil, when they have war, they fortify their own positions. And I think the incursions of more building in East Jerusalem, for instance, is just a provocative move. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, let me tease out your statement a little bit, that I'm sure it was just an inadvertent coupling of the two. But Hamas, of course, is sworn to Israel's destruction, and we know how they conduct their affairs, and rain missiles down upon innocent people and care not a whit for their own people by hiding their missiles within mosques and schools and hospitals and the like. I don't think there's any comparison to Prime Minister Netanyahu. After all, at Y Valley in 1997, brought more or less the right of Israel politics into support of the two-state solution. The Jerusalem issue is a complicated one, but the Prime Minister recently made some interesting comments, one of which is this idea that there are places in Jerusalem where Jews can't build is nefarious. There's no doubt that's the case. I mean, Arabs, Palestinians live in West Jerusalem, Israelis, Jews live in East Jerusalem. That's how it should be. Now, timing can be an issue, and we just had Prime Minister Oren, Michael Oren, historian, Prime Minister, recently in town, and he makes an interesting observation that Israelis don't necessarily have a foreign policy. They have a defense policy, but not necessarily a foreign policy. And he'll be the first to say, as a former ambassador of Israel to the United States, that sometimes Israelis don't have a keen sense of their actions and the impact that they have on diplomacy. Now, if one wants to criticize Prime Minister Netanyahu, I think it's not unreasonable to say that he should, and the entire government should take a careful look before embarking upon necessarily any expansion of places where Jews live in Jerusalem. But that doesn't mean they don't have the right to do it, nor does it mean that Prime Minister Netanyahu isn't committed to peace. I believe the man is, as well as his government. I mean, his government is made up of parties that are strongly committed to the two-state solution, and I think we have to take that into account.
The majority of the parties are in favor of the two-state solution.
Sure.
And he mouths it, but I don't know how much he believes it. I really don't. And it's a shame. Michael Oren is a terrific spokesman, among others, for a peaceful Israel. My very good friend Moshe Triwax, who was in the intelligence division of Israel Army until he was 55, he's now 84, speaks, and with all his friends, they all, whom I spoke to, are in favor of the two-state solution and helping the economy of the Palestinians so that they can get on equal footing or work toward equal footing, because there's a great disparate difference there.
You heard people in, I'll say, center-left in Israel talking in Operation Protective Edge, raising this concern. It's almost as though we can see it, taste it, feel it, the outlines of what a Palestinian state would look like. It's been discussed so many times for so many years with so many different wise people holding forth on the issue that one can see the outlines in their mind's eye, or even see the various plans that have been proposed over the years. But even people of the center and the left were saying, the day that Ben Gurion Airport was closed down by a Hamas missile that landed 5 miles away, it was not a good day for Israel for any number of reasons. And to think, what would be the impact of Hamas or others like Hamas sworn to Israel's destruction, or at least looking to create a massive problem in place in the West Bank, firing mortars at the airport and closing the airport. You close the airport and you close Israel's critical portal to the outside world, not unlike the closing of the States of Tehran by Nasser in May 1967.
Except for the port at Haifa.
Well, the port at Haifa, but the world these days, of course, runs through international airways and flight and the rest. So I just broached that issue because it's something that's very important to contemplate when you're asking about Prime Minister Netanyahu's or most Israelis' view of the world. Yes, fortunately, a significant percentage, majority, as do American Jews, believe in a two-state solution. It's a dangerous route, though, Alan. I think one way to encapsulate it is, what's the more dangerous route? A Palestinian state in the West Bank, or no Palestinian state in the West Bank? With the former, you bring serious security concerns. With the latter, you bring a serious demographic issue. So the choices that all the parties in the Middle East, particularly Israelis and Palestinians, face are not easy to resolve.
But they weren't easy in 1948 either, when Israel wanted to become a country and
Sure.
wasn't. The Jewish Palestinians wanted the country of Israel, and fortunately for them, a man by the name of Harry Truman really took some positive steps, and Israel became a nation. And I see some comparison between what the Palestinians are going through today. They want a nation. They want self-government. They're entitled to it. Everybody is entitled to it.
Well, that goes back to Woodrow Wilson and 14 points and national self-determination and the like. And that's, since Wilson was such a strong exponent of it in 1917 and 1918, 1919 until he had a stroke, it has been a foundation of American foreign policy and American social policy towards the world, and as you say, correctly, rightfully so. The shame of 1947, the unfortunate development of 1947 is when presented with two states for two peoples by the United Nations by vote of November 29, 1947, the response of the Palestinians, but primarily their Arab nations surrounding the mandatory Palestine, was warfare. Now, what if you could turn the clock back and say we should have started the two-state solution process November 30, 1947? We lost a lot of time because of it, to say the least.
But we can't revise history unless you happen to be a right-winger in this country. But I won't get into that. Now, we are approaching a day known as Kristallnacht.
Yes.
When this program is airing, it will be the beginning of November. So explain a little bit about what Kristallnacht was and what it led into.
The 76th anniversary this year. Last year was the 75th, which we commemorated at the Minnesota State Capitol as part of Lawyers Without Rights. It was a joint project of the JCRC and the Minnesota Federal Court and Chief Judge Michael Davis. Both of your next two guests, two very fine jurists, Justice Lillehag and Justice Wright, at one point or another participated in the Lawyers Without Rights, so I'm glad that they're on the show too. Kristallnacht marked the departure of Germany from the civilized world. It was an attack upon the Jewish population of Germany. Thousands of people were incarcerated in the concentration camps in Germany.
It was an orchestrated move.
Many dozens were killed. Jewish businesses attacked in response to the assassination attempt on a German diplomat in Paris, ironically one who harbored secret anti-Nazi feelings. But it was a pogrom that had been planned for a long time, and the idea was to, once and for all, completely marginalize Germany's population to the world. Franklin Roosevelt said in response that one could scarcely believe that such things were possible in a civilized world. Nevertheless, despite...
We've seen many things happen and wonder about how civilized our world is in the decades since.
Despite it all, despite really the last clarion warning from Germany about its intentions about how it was going to deal with issues of Jews in Germany, we know what happened as a result. I said before, though, with all difficult subjects, I always want to talk about something positive, and here's the positive. October 2015 marks the 50th anniversary of the promulgation of the Nostra Aetate. That was the encyclical from Vatican II, which addressed the Catholic Church's relations with non-Christian, non-Catholic religions, primarily Jews. And two important points arose from the Nostra Aetate, which means in our time in Latin. That is, the idea that Jews were no longer collectively responsible for the death of Jesus, the charge of deicide, and two, that the Church affirmed the ongoing living Jewish covenantal relationship with God. That relates to the Holocaust, because so much anti-Semitism, so many attacks on Jews were related to these terrible theological misapprehensions. Okay, the really good news is it's helped spawn, so to speak, a remarkable transformation in Christian-Jewish relations in the last 50 years abroad and in the United States. And because of that, we're commemorating it and celebrating it with Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, JCRC, J. Phillips Center of University of St. Thomas, and St. John's Minnesota Rabbinical Association. There's going to be a series of programming. So my point here is...
We'll have you back and talk about that.
Well, and some of our wonderful Catholic interlocutors with whom we're working, Father Eric Rutten of the Archdiocese, who's also the pastor of the University of St. Thomas, my dear friend Jason Atkins, who's the executive director of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, but all sorts of important and wonderful people who are getting involved.
One thing I want to touch on,
Sure.
because you are certainly very prolific in terms of articles and speaking engagements, things like that. But one letter that you wrote recently to, I think, the Star Tribune, had to do with a restaurant locally that has an annual, I don't know, they call it a reenactment or whatever, of World War II, where the guests all come in Nazi uniform, German uniforms. They hang Nazi flags and things like that. And you had a very outspoken reaction to that. We've only got 2.5 minutes left, so.
We'd asked the restaurant owner, and I went and met with Mario and had an interesting conversation with him, and he says
it is a German restaurant.
Yeah, it's a German restaurant. He says he's not going to do it again. He says he really didn't necessarily appreciate what it was that was occurring in the restaurant. But the point we made in print and the point I made to him in person is this. In particular, there you are in Northeast Minneapolis. You have the streets that are named for the United States presidents. You have any number of young men from the Edison, Roosevelt, the Northeast Minneapolis high schools that went abroad, fought in the European theater of operations, some who were killed or badly wounded in action. And you host at your restaurant the glorification of the SS. Just inappropriate and wrong, and sort of blind eye to the realities of the situation. And nobody wants to be on that side of history, so don't do it.
Sometimes people will rent a restaurant for a night, and the owner is not necessarily that conversant with what they plan to do there. So do we give them the benefit of the doubt on that?
Well, I credit Mario with saying I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not here to comment about Mario's knowledge of the situation and what he knew or didn't know about the reenactors. But it simply not what anybody wants on their premises are people who are glorifying the Third Reich and glorifying the SS and people who are engaged in war crimes. And that's the point we were making to him. And meanwhile, you dishonor the memory of American veterans who fought the SS and the Western Front, one of whom would have been my cousin Sonny Cohen, who was killed in action D-Day +6 in France. So that was the point we were making.
The incredible thing about my interviews with you and our conversations is that we use up the half hour. I never get to all the things that we want to talk about because we get involved in the things that we should talk about. And that just means, number one, that you have to come back. Excuse me. Number two, I want to say thank you for my unexpected gift. And number three, let's remind people again that is at the Riverview Theater. On October 26th will be the premiere of this wonderful documentary by the documentarian Spielberg, sister of Steven Spielberg. And we've been speaking with Steve Hunegs. Thank you, sir, and come back again.
Thank you, and happy and healthy New Year.